In the great days of expansion of the Catholic Church in the United States, when immigrants, the poor, poured in from all of the great Catholic places in the world and took their place here, there was a kind of pact, a sort of agreement that was reached. Because many of these people knew no more about their faith than they could put on a matchbook cover. They knew they were Catholic, but that was, for the most, in many cases, that was it. They lived under brutal racial and religious discrimination. That is the history of the church in the United States and here in Oklahoma. And in the face of their poverty, their ignorance, and the discrimination that they faced, this kind of pact was enacted. That their presence in the church, along with the accompaniment of their practice, they observed the rules about fasting. They were to come to church on Sunday. They were to live the basis of the good moral life, being married and practicing basic charity. And they would take their place in the life of the church as good and decent people. And that pact was enacted. It was relatively simple and straightforward. And it was acted out in the lives of my grandparents and my parents, just as certainly and as surely and with great confidence. And the church grew and prospered all this time. And then came the 1960s, where we, as a country, began the first part of dealing with, of coming to terms with the racial problems of our country and the grave discrimination racially that was a part of the life of this country, especially in the lives of my grandparents and my parents. And suddenly this understanding began to fall apart. That those who very confidently fulfilled the church's expectations in the most straightforward way came to churches on Sunday. This is especially true in the great Catholic centers in the Northeast. They came to church on Sunday, and from the pulpit they heard that they had participated in this great horrific sin of racism. And by their participation in it, they simply going along with what they were used to, were guilty of a grave offense. And it felt as if the floor that they were standing on had simply dropped away, but the rug that they were sitting on had been pulled out from under them. They thought of themselves as good people. They simply lived in the corner of the world that had been entrusted to them. And it was as if everything changed. Racism is a sin, and they were complicit in it. To divide the world up according to skin color and origin, and to say, we're comfortable on our side as long as they stay on their side, is a sin against justice. And what they were equipped to do in all of the evaluations that they had grown up with, they found that they were mute. They didn't know what to do. The simple life that they had been given had suddenly grown complicated. It was the moral reckoning that fell on their shoulders, the shoulders of my grandparents and my parents, and by extension, to me. The most terrifying phrase in all of the scriptures is this one that ends the reading from Luke's gospel. The measure we measure with is the measure measured back to us. It's difficult. It sounds that kind of moral evaluation is something, of course, that we all understand. We all have a sense of it. Talk to any 8-year-old about anything, whether he's playing baseball or getting an ice cream cone, and he will give you his sense of what's fair. And if you grew up in a family like mine and everything was divided several ways, you have an eagle eye about who might get more than you. And so everybody says, wait a minute, he got half an inch more, an ounce more, half a bit more, and it's not fair. Because there is inside of us this sense that the world ought to be divided up in an appropriate way, and if we're left out, that it isn't fair. And by extension, we can look at what others receive apart from us and acknowledge that if they don't get their part, it's not fair either. C.S. Lewis describes this in his book, Mere Christianity, when he simply appeals to the fact that there is this sort of moral measurement in us, no matter who we are or where we come from. We don't have to be instructed very much to know that there is, that we grow up with this sense of balance in the world. And we may acknowledge that in our sense of balance, we deserve twice as much as they. Or that those others over there can simply presume 4 times as much as we have. However the balance is struck, whatever the map looks like, we know whether we're getting our part or not. We know that there ought to be a balance, and when it's out of balance, we know it. So whatever the measure is, whether we're doing feet and yards or meters and centimeters, the measure measured back, the measure we measure with is the measure measured back to us. And we know that that's written into our hearts, not just in the scriptures. It's simple arithmetic. And while we might have different maps, and while we might look at a landscape that's different than some other landscape, so that the mountains and the valleys and the trails that we look at on our map might be different than the plains and the streets that others look like on their map, we all understand that the pathway is what we're interested in, and we all understand there is one, and whether we're on it or not. We can cite our coordinates and understand one another. That's what Jesus says, after all. The measure you measure with is the measure measured back to me, whatever the measure looks like. And Jesus adds an additional reminder as he runs through the descriptions and the measures, just so that we know it isn't simply a matter of arithmetic. For he says, be merciful as your Father is merciful. It follows on, captured up in our lives. It's something that's measure for measure, but it's often left out or left on as an afterthought. Because mercy isn't arithmetical. It's not quite described in getting and giving, or treating you as you want to be treated. Because mercy is beyond the boundaries. It's more than we deserve and more than we expect. Mercy is to be treated, as a son when you're a stranger. Mercy is to be given a reward when you don't deserve one. Mercy is being remembered, it's being honored when you have no right or call to be remembered or honored. Mercy is bigger than simply saying, I deserve my part. Mercy is what's poured out and deluges us especially when we don't deserve it. And Jesus says, oh, measure for measure, but mercy for mercy. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Or there is the story between the old priest and the younger priest. The younger priest is complaining that in all of the work that he does and the sacrifices that he endures, he complains that no one will remember or appreciate everything he does. It's as if it simply disappears. I give and I sacrifice and I pour myself out. And who will notice? Who cares? Of course, he could be a parent. He'd be the same. A careful manager, the same. Simply a careful person in a decent friendship, the same. But the old priest had a good response. He said, well, remember, if what you want is for everyone to know what you do, then you'd have to endure the fact that they'd know everything you do. Ooh, who would want that? No, he said, be grateful that along with what you do, in the minds of all those that you touch, there is a good measure of forgetfulness. That is, after all, how they can live with you. Mercy is to receive more than we deserve. Mercy is to accept and to receive more than is our due. Mercy is when all those folks know you and love you anyway. So more than measure for measure, we are to be merciful. We are to burst the bounds of quid pro quo because God treats us just that way. But the great gift, the great call to anyone to live as Christ would have us, is the great profligacy of goodness that we are invited to. God has pushed the boundaries of goodness, the measure of life, beyond anything we could come up with. And we are to do the same. What we might do is contrast two options. The first is this. When we ask, what do I owe? It's a good question. It's one we approach as a kind of bookkeeping that makes things right and keeps them that way. And if everyone simply were serious about answering that question, why, the world would be certainly a more just place. And it is necessary for us to know what I owe my family, what I owe my parents, what I owe my country. The questions and the answers are endless because the world is always in motion, and so are we. And so the calculation is always changing. What do I owe prepares us to respond with a responsibility and a boundary. What I owe is important, and what I don't owe anymore is also important. Break a dish in a store, wreck a car on a highway, spoil a neighbor's wedding. God, if someone would just say, what do I owe? Well, then all of those things could be remedied, maybe even healed. It's a good question to ask. What do I owe? But there's another option, and it's this. What can I give? That's Jesus' invitation. It's a different question and one that's harder to answer. After all, the Latin saying is, no one gives what he doesn't have. And so it's easy to look into our pockets and turn them inside out and put into our hands what we have and say, I can only give this much. But of course, life isn't just the change that you have in your pocket. Life is a bigger and fuller experience. And many times we don't know what we can give until we give it. We seldom know what we have until it's given. We're like the musician whose talent exists only so that it can be given away. The greatest pianist in the world's talent is so that all of those notes on a piece of paper become real music at her fingers. Real music that sounds so that we can hear. We who have no music in our souls except what we can receive from her. What she is given is to be given away. How could anyone know she were the greatest musician unless she played for someone else? It's in the giving that we know what we can give. It's in the surrendering that we know what can be offered. It's in opening ourselves that we can know what's there. So we give, and in the giving, find out what is the great blessing. Remember the Oklahoma City bombing, 1995? My brother was just beginning at the fire department then, and he was involved in this great rush of response and then the follow-up at the bombing. He said, of course, the one who was in charge of organizing the effort, he commented one time that in the days following the bombing, that he could have asked the people of Oklahoma. He said, I could have asked them for a gold-plated battleship on 4th and Walker, and they would have done everything to get one there for me. People didn't ask at that moment, what do we owe? They asked, what can we give? Because the only appropriate response in the face of such horror wasn't to ask, what's the limits of our responsibility, but it is to ask, how can we heal? What can we give? If we see tornado victims walking around in the ruins of what had been their houses, staring at their clothes strewn across the street, we ask, what can we give? Or in a car accident, watching the people from the car staring at one another in shock, we ask, what can we give? Or when a father holds his baby for the first time, he doesn't ask, now what do I owe? But looks her in the face and says, what can I give? The response of generosity and gratitude is what forms us. It is the invitation to live life in a way that's grander and greater than any of us can imagine. The response of generosity and gratitude is the heart of our lives. And to know our lives are configured not by measure and portion and limit, but by blessing and promise and gratitude. Or as the Sisters of Mercy used to teach us when I was in the first grade. And the sisters taught us everything from exactly how to genuflect and precisely how to make the sign of the cross. They taught us this, that when you fold your hands in their view of things, when you fold your hands, you put your left thumb over your right thumb. Because your right thumb is what justice is, what's right. You put your left thumb over your right thumb because mercy is more important than justice. What I owe is what makes the world. What I can give makes heaven. The measure you measure with is the measure measured back to you.